A mysterious squadron of military jets landing at dawn that would not only save a struggling family farm from foreclosure, but uncover a pioneering female pilot's legacy that would transform our understanding of aviation history. And the astonishing connection between modern flight patterns and a grandmother's secret wartime service that had remained hidden for over 70 years, all triggered by one daughter's stubborn refusal to sell her family's heritage to developers. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if this journey of discovery intrigues you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've prepared something truly special for you. The summer heat shimmered above the withering cornfields as Mackenzie Collins stared at the foreclosure notice spread across her kitchen table. At 29, the agricultural engineer had exhausted nearly every legal option to save the 220-acre farm that had been in her family since 1928. 2 consecutive years of drought followed by mounting debts had left her with impossible choices. Sell the land to Meridian Development Corporation for their planned luxury housing community, or watch the bank take everything in 60 days. "Dad would never forgive me," she muttered, glancing at the photograph of Thomas Collins that hung above the fireplace. Her father had passed away just 8 months earlier after a brief battle with cancer, leaving Mackenzie with a property she couldn't afford to maintain, and his final words echoing in her ears. "Promise me you'll keep the land, Mac. There's more value in it than you know." The sound of a car door slamming drew her attention to the window. Her older brother Ryan had arrived from Chicago, where he worked as a commercial real estate attorney. "The developers called again," he announced without preamble as he entered the kitchen. "They've increased their offer by another 100,000. Mac, we need to be reasonable about this." "Dad's final wish was for us to keep the farm," she countered, sliding the foreclosure notice toward him. "Dad wasn't facing financial reality," Ryan sighed. "This property is hemorrhaging money. Meridian's offer is more than generous." Before Mackenzie could respond, a familiar sound drew their attention skyward, the distant roar of military jets passing overhead. Growing up near Westfield Air Force Base, they had become accustomed to these daily training flights, but something about them had always fascinated their father. He would often stop whatever he was doing to watch the aircraft until they disappeared from view. "I need to go through Dad's things before making any decisions," Mackenzie said firmly. He kept saying there was something important about this. "Land." Ryan checked his watch impatiently. "The Meridian executives are coming tomorrow for our final answer. We're talking about financial security versus hanging on to land that's draining what little inheritance we have left." "Just give me tonight," Mackenzie pleaded. "One night to look through his papers." After Ryan left to check into his hotel, Mackenzie climbed the narrow stairs to the attic where her father had maintained his home office. The space was stifling in the summer heat, filled with filing cabinets and boxes containing decades of family records. For hours, she sifted through agricultural records, weather patterns, and old photographs, finding nothing that explained his insistence on keeping the financially untenable property. As evening approached, her frustration mounting, Mackenzie noticed the ancient roll-top desk that had belonged to her grandmother, Eleanor Collins. The desk had always been off-limits during her childhood, her father's private space that contained boring paperwork. The desk was locked, but Mackenzie remembered the small key had always hung behind a loose panel in the wall, a hiding place she'd discovered as a curious 12-year-old. To her surprise, the key was still there. The roll-top opened with a protesting creak, revealing meticulously organized compartments. At the center lay a leather-bound journal with EC 1942-1945 embossed on its worn cover. Eleanor Collins, her grandmother who had died before Mackenzie was born. Inside, the pages were filled with elegant handwriting, technical drawings, and what appeared to be flight calculations. The entries began in 1942, during World War II. March 15, 1942. Received final approval from Major Barrett today. We begin construction of the auxiliary airfield next week. The location is perfect. Far enough from Westfield to avoid drawing attention, but close enough for training purposes. Mackenzie read with growing astonishment as the journal detailed her grandmother's involvement in a classified program, developing an emergency landing field on what was now their family farm. Eleanor hadn't just provided the land. She had been an accomplished pilot herself, contributing to military training programs while prohibited from serving in combat roles. June 7th, 1943. Another successful night landing exercise. The modifications to the runway lighting system proved effective even in heavy cloud cover. Captain Whitmore has requested permission to implement similar designs at 3 other auxiliary fields. My contribution remains officially unacknowledged. Of course, the journal revealed that Eleanor Collins had been far more than the simple farmer's wife described in family stories. She had been a pioneering aviator whose technical innovations had improved safety protocols for military aircraft, all while maintaining the cover of running the family farm during her husband's deployment overseas. Most significant were the detailed maps showing the precise location of the Nighthawk Field, an auxiliary airstrip constructed on the eastern portion of their property, an area that had always been oddly unsuitable for farming. What appeared to be poor soil conditions was, according to Eleanor's notes, the result of specialized materials used to create a concealed landing surface. The final pages contained something even more startling. A formal agreement signed by military authorities in 1945 designating the Collins property as a silent heritage site with specific provisions. In recognition of Eleanor Collins's significant contributions to aviation safety systems, the property designated in the attached survey shall remain under Collins family ownership in perpetuity. The technical innovations developed on this site have been incorporated into standard military aviation procedures under classified designation ECNL 42. Should Collins' descendants wish to transfer ownership, the Department of War reserves the right of first refusal. Attached was a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To be opened only if the land's ownership is threatened." Inside was a letter dated 1965, written by her grandmother shortly before her death. To my descendants. If you are reading this, our family's connection to the land is in jeopardy. What appears to be simply a farm has played a crucial role in aviation history that has remained classified. The eastern field contains the remains of an experimental runway system whose design principles are still in use today. The approach patterns used by military aircraft in this region follow paths I established in 1943 that proved optimal for emergency procedures. Should you need to verify this history, contact the commanding officer at Westfield Air Force Base and reference authorization code Nighthawk EC 4245. This will grant access to records that have remained sealed but should by now be eligible for declassification. This land represents more than family heritage. It is a historical site whose significance has been deliberately obscured. With love, Eleanor Collins. As Mackenzie finished reading, she became aware of the familiar sound of jets passing overhead, the same flight patterns her father had watched so intently throughout his life. With sudden clarity, she understood his insistence on keeping the property. He had been protecting his mother's legacy. What Mackenzie Collins couldn't possibly know, as she carefully placed the journal on her kitchen table, was that her discovery would not only save the family farm, but would trigger a re-evaluation of women's unacknowledged contributions to military aviation that would reshape historical records. The following morning, as Mackenzie prepared to confront both her brother and the developers with her discovery, the distinctive sound of approaching aircraft drew her attention to the window. Instead of the usual training jets passing in the distance, she was astonished to see 3 military helicopters heading directly toward her property, followed by a convoy of official vehicles turning onto her driveway from the main road. Mackenzie hurriedly gathered her grandmother's journal and documents, her heart racing as the sound of helicopter rotors grew louder. Through the kitchen window, she watched as 3 military helicopters circled once, before setting down in the eastern field, the very area her grandmother's journal had identified as the Nighthawk Field. "What the hell is going on?" Ryan demanded, as he burst through the front door, his meeting attire incongruous with the chaos unfolding outside. "Why are there military helicopters landing on our property?" "I think it has something to do with what I found last night," Mackenzie replied, clutching Eleanor's journal to her chest. Before she could explain further, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. Outside stood a woman in an Air Force colonel's uniform, flanked by 2 junior officers. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and despite being in her late 50s, she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. "Ms. Collins, I'm Colonel Victoria Hargrove, commander of the 89th Historical Operations Division at Westfield Air Force Base." She presented her credentials with practiced efficiency. "I understand you may have information regarding Operation Nighthawk. May we come in?" Stunned by the rapid sequence of events, Mackenzie stepped aside to allow the officers' entry. As they settled around the kitchen table, Colonel Hargrove's gaze fixed immediately on Eleanor's journal. "I see you've found it," she said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "We've been monitoring this property for decades, but protocol prevented direct intervention without specific circumstances." "Monitoring our property?" Ryan interjected, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "On what legal basis?" Colonel Hargrove turned to him with a measured expression. "The 1945 Silent Heritage designation, Mr. Collins. Your family farm sits on what was once one of the most significant classified aviation sites of World War II. I found our grandmother's journal in the attic last night," Mackenzie explained, sliding the leather-bound book across the table. "It mentions an authorization code, Nighthawk EC 4245. The colonel's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only break in her composed exterior. "You activated the verification protocol." She turned to one of her aides. "Contact General Winters immediately. Tell him the Nighthawk designation has been confirmed." As the aide stepped outside to make the call, Colonel Hargrove unfolded a topographical map of the Collins property. "What you've discovered, Ms. Collins, is evidence of a classified program that revolutionized military aviation safety. Your grandmother wasn't just any pilot. She was one of the most innovative minds in aviation history, though official records were deliberately sanitized of her contributions." "Because she was a woman," Mackenzie stated, recalling Eleanor's letter. "Precisely," the colonel confirmed. "During World War II, women pilots like your grandmother were restricted to non-combat roles despite their expertise. Eleanor Collins used this limitation to her advantage, establishing this site as a testing ground for landing system innovations that would have faced years of bureaucratic delays through official channels." Ryan stared at the unfolding situation with growing disbelief. "So our grandmother was some kind of secret aviation pioneer? And that's why military jets have been flying over our property all these years?" "Not just flying over," Colonel Hargrove clarified, "following precise approach patterns that your grandmother designed. The ECNL 42 protocol, Eleanor Collins. Night landing 1942 remains the foundation for emergency approach procedures used by military pilots worldwide." Through the window, Mackenzie noticed additional vehicles arriving, unmarked SUVs, and what appeared to be specialized equipment. Trucks. Men and women in both military uniforms and civilian attire began establishing a perimeter around the eastern field. "What exactly is happening out there?" she asked. "Historical verification and site assessment," Colonel Hargrove explained. "The activation of the Nighthawk Protocol triggers automatic declassification of all related historical documents. After 75 years, your grandmother's contributions can finally be officially acknowledged." One of the junior officers placed a secure tablet on the table, displaying a video call with an elderly man in a general's uniform. "Colonel Hargrove, I understand the Nighthawk verification has been confirmed," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority despite his advanced age. "Yes, General. Miss Collins discovered her grandmother's journal and activated the protocol exactly as Eleanor anticipated someone might eventually do." The general's weathered face broke into a smile as he addressed Mackenzie directly. "Ms. Collins, I'm General James Winters. I never had the privilege of meeting your grandmother, but her work saved my life during a training accident in 1978. The approach lighting system she designed guided me to a safe emergency landing in conditions that would have been fatal without her innovations." As the general continued, explaining how Eleanor Collins' work had been incorporated into standard aviation protocols worldwide while her name remained classified, Mackenzie struggled to reconcile this extraordinary revelation with the simple family history she had always known. "The historical injustice of your grandmother's unacknowledged contributions has troubled many of us for decades," General Winters continued. "But the classified nature of her work made proper recognition impossible until the mandatory declassification period expired or until a family member activated the verification protocol she established." Colonel Hargrove handed Mackenzie a formal document bearing Defense Department seals. "This is the declassification order for all Nighthawk-related materials. As of this morning, your grandmother's contributions will be officially incorporated into military aviation history." Ryan, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, finally found his voice. "This is all fascinating historical information, but how does it affect our current situation? We still have a foreclosure notice and developers arriving in," he checked his watch, "less than 2 hours." The colonel and general exchanged significant glances before General Winters addressed them both. "The activation of the Nighthawk Protocol triggers several automatic provisions that directly impact your property's status. First, the Collins farm is immediately classified as a National Historical Aviation Site with all associated protections. Second, the original compensation agreement for your grandmother's innovations, which has remained in escrow pending declassification, is now authorized for release to her direct descendants." "Compensation agreement," Mackenzie echoed. Colonel Hargrove nodded. "Eleanor Collins refused direct payment for her innovations, insisting instead that compensation be held in trust until her work could be publicly acknowledged. That trust has been accumulating interest since 1945. With careful formality, she presented another document. The current value, adjusted for inflation and interest, stands at approximately $4.7 million. Ryan nearly choked, his practiced professional demeanor momentarily abandoned. $4.7 million? Your grandmother's innovations have saved countless military and civilian lives over the decades, General Winters explained from the video screen. The value of her contributions cannot truly be calculated, but the trust represents our best attempt at appropriate recognition. As Mackenzie attempted to process this extraordinary development, Colonel Hargrove continued with practiced efficiency. A military historical preservation team will begin formal assessment of the eastern field today. The buried runway infrastructure and testing facilities have been monitored via satellite imaging for decades, but now they can be properly documented and preserved. Outside, additional helicopters were arriving, carrying what appeared to be specialized equipment and more personnel. The sleepy farm that had faced imminent foreclosure just hours earlier was transforming into a hive of coordinated military activity. "I still don't understand why Dad never told us about any of this," Mackenzie said, looking down at her grandmother's photograph in the journal. "He must have known something." "Your father contacted Westfield Air Force Base once in 1997, Colonel Hargrove revealed. He discovered some of your grandmother's papers, but didn't have the authorization code. Military secrecy protocols prevented us from confirming or denying anything without proper verification. We could only advise him to maintain the property until classification expired. So that's why he was so adamant about keeping the farm." Ryan realized. He knew it was important, but didn't know exactly why. As they continued discussing the implications of these revelations, the distinctive sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention to the driveway. A sleek black town car and two support vehicles bearing the Meridian Development Corporation logo had arrived for their scheduled meeting. "The developers," Ryan said unnecessarily, glancing between the military operation unfolding in their fields and the corporate executives now exiting their vehicles with evident confusion. "This should be interesting." Colonel Hargrove stood with military precision. "Perhaps I should join you for this meeting, Ms. Collins. The historical significance of this property has just become a matter of national interest, and certain adjustments to your negotiations may be appropriate." As Charles Meridian himself approached the house, his expression cycling between confusion and concern at the military presence, Mackenzie felt a surge of confidence that would have been unimaginable just 24 hours earlier. "Colonel," she said, gathering her grandmother's journal and the official documents, "I think that's an excellent idea." The meeting that followed in the Collins farmhouse kitchen would later be described by Meridian's executive assistant as the most extraordinary negotiation reversal she had ever witnessed. What had been planned as a simple property acquisition quickly transformed into a discussion of heritage preservation, historical significance, and the potential for a public-private partnership that would honor Eleanor Collins's legacy while meeting the region's development needs. "Let me be clear, Mr. Meridian," Colonel Hargrove stated after introductions had been made and the situation explained in classified, cleared terms. "This property has just been designated a National Historical Aviation Site. Development plans that would compromise the eastern field's integrity are no longer viable options." Charles Meridian, a shrewd businessman who had built his fortune recognizing opportunities others missed, studied the situation with calculating intensity. "Colonel, I recognize the historical significance you're describing. Perhaps instead of our original concept, Meridian could develop a mixed-use project that incorporates an aviation heritage center. The market for historical tourism is substantial." As the developers and military officials began discussing potential collaborative approaches, Mackenzie stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The farm that had seemed like a financial burden just yesterday had been revealed as something far more significant. A piece of hidden history that connected directly to the military aircraft that had flown overhead throughout her life. In the eastern field, teams were already using ground-penetrating radar to map the buried runway infrastructure her grandmother had helped design. The jets that had always drawn her father's attention now flew overhead with new meaning, not just random training exercises, but continuations of flight patterns Eleanor Collins had established decades earlier. What had begun with a desperate search through her father's papers had uncovered not just a family secret, but a chapter of military history that had been deliberately obscured. A Woman's contributions erased from official records, but preserved through the secret legacy of a family farm and the flight patterns that continued to trace her innovation across the sky. 3 weeks had passed since military helicopters first landed on the Collins farm, transforming both the property and Mackenzie's understanding of her family's legacy. The initial frantic activity had evolved into a methodical historical preservation project, with specialized teams meticulously documenting every aspect of what was now officially designated as the Eleanor Collins Aviation Innovation Site. Mackenzie sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the morning sun illuminate the eastern field where archaeologists and military historians worked in coordinated patterns. The runway infrastructure, buried beneath decades of topsoil, was slowly being revealed through careful excavation, not to be removed, but to be documented and preserved as a living testament to her grandmother's ingenuity. The ground-penetrating radar confirmed everything from your grandmother's journal, said Dr. Catherine Reynolds, the Smithsonian aviation historian who had arrived 10 days earlier to oversee the historical documentation. The approach lighting system she designed was decades ahead of contemporary technology. We've found components that weren't officially invented until the 1960s. I still can't believe she created all this in secret, Mackenzie replied, glancing at the expanded collection of photographs and documents that had been delivered from recently declassified military archives. Each new discovery had further illuminated Eleanor Collins' extraordinary contributions to aviation safety. Women like your grandmother operated in extraordinary constraints, Dr. Reynolds explained, her academic tone softened by evident admiration. Denied official recognition or authority, they found ways to contribute that circumvented the barriers of their time. The true ingenuity wasn't just in the technical innovations, but in creating systems that allowed those innovations to be implemented. Despite institutional resistance, Ryan emerged from the farmhouse with a stack of legal documents, his attorney's demeanor now directed toward protecting his family's newly discovered legacy rather than liquidating it. The initial shock of their heritage had transformed his perspective completely. The National Aviation Historical Society has approved the preliminary preservation plan, he announced, handing Mackenzie the top document from his stack. And the Collins Historical Trust has been officially established with the compensation funds. Once we finalize the governance structure, we can begin implementing the educational programs. The trust, established with the declassified compensation for Eleanor's innovations, had been structured to serve multiple purposes: maintaining the property as a historical site, developing educational programs about women's contributions to aviation history, and supporting engineering scholarships for young women interested in aviation careers. Colonel Hargrove called from Washington, Ryan continued. The Congressional Committee has scheduled the formal recognition ceremony for next month. They're fast-tracking the process due to the historical significance. Before Mackenzie could respond, the familiar sound of approaching aircraft drew their attention skyward. Unlike the routine training flights that had passed overhead for decades, this formation was different, a precision flying team in World War II-era training aircraft, executing a perfect approach pattern directly above the eastern field. The Heritage Squadron, Dr. Reynolds explained, smiling at Mackenzie's surprised expression. They've been practicing Eleanor's exact approach patterns from her original flight logs. For the ceremony, they'll demonstrate how her innovations transformed aviation safety in adverse conditions. As they watched the vintage aircraft executing the precise patterns Eleanor had designed, a black SUV turned into the driveway. From it emerged an elderly woman in a formal Air Force dress uniform, adorned with the insignia of a retired general. Despite her advanced age, she moved with remarkable vigor, her bearing unmistakably military. "General Mitchell," Dr. Reynolds said, with evident respect, moving to greet the visitor. "We weren't expecting you until next week." The elderly woman clasped Dr. Reynolds' offered hand before turning to Mackenzie. "When they located Eleanor's original flight logs in the Pentagon archives, I couldn't wait any longer. I had to come. Immediately." "Mackenzie, this is General Rebecca Mitchell," Dr. Reynolds explained. "She was among the first female military pilots to be formally commissioned after the barriers were removed in the 1970s. "Ms. Collins," the general said with unexpected emotion, "your grandmother's work saved my life before I even knew she existed. In 1973, I was flying a training mission when severe weather forced an emergency approach to Westfield. The lighting system guided me home in zero visibility conditions. It wasn't until last month, when the Nighthawk files were declassified, that I learned it was a system designed by another female pilot nearly 30 years before I was allowed to wear this uniform." Inside the farmhouse, now functioning as an impromptu research center, General Mitchell shared photographs and documents that connected Eleanor Collins to a broader network of women who had contributed to aviation advancement while denied official roles. "Your grandmother wasn't alone," she explained, spreading out a group photograph showing Eleanor with 4 other women standing beside a partially disassembled aircraft engine. There was an informal network of female aviation experts who found ways to contribute despite institutional barriers. They called themselves the Invisible Wings, women who advanced aviation while remaining deliberately unseen in official records. Mackenzie studied the photograph, seeing her grandmother in a completely new context. Not just a farmer's wife, but part of a secret network of women who had shaped aviation history from the shadows. Why would they accept working without recognition? Because the alternative was not working at all, General Mitchell replied simply. In that era, women who demanded credit often found themselves excluded entirely. Your grandmother and women like her made a different calculation. They chose impact over acknowledgement, trusting that someday the truth would emerge. As the day progressed, the activity on the farm intensified with the arrival of additional specialists. Architectural preservationists examined the barn, which Eleanor's journal had revealed contained a hidden design studio where she had developed her innovations. Forensic accountants traced the complex financial arrangements that had maintained the property's security clearance through generations. Most significantly, aviation engineers arrived to document the technical specifications of Eleanor's lighting system using her original designs. The system, revolutionary in 1943, had evolved into standard protocols still used in modern aviation, though the connections to their true originator had been deliberately obscured in official records. We've identified at least 17 current FAA safety protocols that derive directly from your grandmother's innovations, explained Commander Jessica Ramirez, the military aviation engineer overseeing the technical documentation. Her approach, vector calculations for adverse weather conditions, haven't been improved upon in 75 years. They were mathematically perfect from the beginning. Late that afternoon, as Mackenzie walked the perimeter of the eastern field with General Mitchell, the elderly officer shared a personal perspective that moved beyond official documentation. Women like your grandmother changed history without being in the history books, she said, watching the excavation teams carefully uncovering remnants of the runway lighting system. They understood something profound about progress, that sometimes advancing a cause requires sacrificing personal recognition for the greater impact. She gestured toward the military and civilian specialists working throughout the property. What you're witnessing isn't just historical documentation, it's historical correction. Your grandmother's story represents thousands of women whose contributions were systematically erased from official records. As twilight approached, Mackenzie found herself drawn to the small family cemetery at the edge of the property, where both her father and grandmother were buried. Eleanor's simple headstone had always described her as beloved wife and mother, 1919-1965, an epitaph that captured nothing of the extraordinary legacy now being uncovered. Standing beside the grave, Mackenzie was surprised to find Colonel Hargrove, who had returned from Washington specifically to oversee the next phase of the preservation project. "The Historical Commission has approved an updated memorial," the colonel said quietly, noticing Mackenzie's focus on the headstone. "With your permission, of course, something that acknowledges who she truly was." "She never received recognition during her lifetime," Mackenzie observed, a question implicit in her words. Colonel Hargrove's professional demeanor softened momentarily. "That's what makes your discovery so significant, Ms. Collins. Your grandmother designed the verification protocol with remarkable foresight. She understood that the world wasn't ready to acknowledge her contributions in her lifetime, but she created a pathway for eventual recognition when society had evolved enough to see women's achievements clearly." As they walked back toward the farmhouse in the gathering darkness, the colonel elaborated on the broader significance of the Nighthawk discovery. "This isn't just about correcting the historical record for one woman. The Eleanor Collins case has triggered a comprehensive review of classified aviation history, specifically focused on identifying other women whose contributions may have been systematically obscured." Inside, they found Ryan in intense discussion with representatives from the Smithsonian Institution and the National Aviation Hall of Fame, planning the public exhibition that would eventually share Eleanor's story with the world. "The preliminary exhibit design has been approved," he informed Mackenzie, his earlier skepticism completely transformed into passionate advocacy for their grandmother's legacy. "They're fast-tracking the process to coincide with the congressional recognition ceremony." As night fell over the Collins farm, now humming with activity that would continue through the darkness, Mackenzie stepped onto the porch for a moment of quiet reflection. The property that had so nearly been sold to developers had been revealed as something far more significant, a hidden chapter of aviation history that connected directly to the flight paths still tracing their way across the sky above. In the eastern field, specially designed lights now illuminated the archaeological work continuing into the night. Lights arranged in patterns matching Eleanor's original designs, guiding the present-day work of uncovering her long-hidden legacy. What had begun with a desperate search through her father's papers had unveiled not just a family secret, but a deliberate historical erasure that was now being methodically corrected. The jets that had drawn her father's attention throughout his life had been following patterns designed by his mother, patterns that had saved countless lives while their creator remained anonymous, her contributions hidden beneath the surface of official history, just as her runway lay buried beneath the peaceful-seeming farmland. As Mackenzie watched the precise choreography of experts working to document and preserve her grandmother's legacy, she realized that the farm had never truly been at risk of being lost. Eleanor Collins had ensured its protection decades ago, anticipating a future where the truth could finally emerge, a future that had arrived just in time, triggered by one granddaughter's determination to understand why a seemingly ordinary farm had been worth protecting at all costs. Morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Special Exhibition Hall as Mackenzie adjusted her grandmother's leather flight jacket on its custom display stand. 2 months had passed since the discovery of Eleanor's journal, and today marked the official opening of Invisible Wings, the Eleanor Collins legacy and women's untold contributions to aviation history. The lighting needs to be adjusted too. "Degrees," instructed Dr. Reynolds, the Smithsonian curator, who had become both colleague and friend during the intensive preparation for this exhibition. "Eleanor's original design sketches are light-sensitive, and we need to ensure optimal preservation. while maintaining visibility. Around them, museum staff made final preparations for the day's ceremonies. What had begun as a modest historical exhibition had evolved into a major national event, with the Secretary of Defense, congressional representatives, and military leaders scheduled to attend the official recognition of Eleanor Collins's long-hidden contributions to aviation safety. "I still can't believe this is happening," Mackenzie said quietly, stepping back to take in the comprehensive exhibition. Her grandmother's journals, technical drawings, and personal effects were displayed alongside recently declassified military documents that traced how her innovations had been incorporated into standard aviation procedures worldwide. All while, her name had been systematically removed from official records. "Your grandmother's story has catalyzed something remarkable," Dr. Reynolds replied, making a final adjustment to a display case containing Eleanor's original calculator and drafting tools. The Pentagon's comprehensive review of the invisible Wings network has already identified 27 other women whose technical contributions were similarly obscured in official records. This exhibition is just the beginning of a major historical correction. Ryan approached, looking almost unrecognizable in his formal attire compared to the aggressive real estate attorney who had pushed to sell the farm just months earlier. "The Secretary's advance team says they're on schedule. General Mitchell is already in the VIP reception area with the other Nighthawk generation pilots." The term had emerged to describe the generations of military pilots who had unknowingly benefited from Eleanor's innovations. Men and women whose lives had been saved by emergency approach systems designed by a farmer's wife whose name they had never known. "And the Collins family?" Mackenzie asked, thinking of the relatives who had traveled from across the country after learning of their unexpected heritage. "Assembled in the family gallery," Ryan confirmed. "Aunt Judith is beside herself. Apparently she remembers Grandma. Eleanor showing her special math games that we now know were actually aviation calculations disguised as puzzles." As they moved toward the central exhibition hall, Mackenzie was struck by how completely her understanding of her family had transformed. What had seemed like an ordinary farming legacy with typical generational struggles had been revealed as something far more extraordinary. A deliberate cover for innovations that had shaped aviation history while remaining hidden from public recognition. The exhibition's centerpiece was a full-scale recreation of the Eastern Field's runway lighting system, constructed according to Eleanor's original designs. Alongside it, interactive displays demonstrated how her approach vector calculations had revolutionized emergency landing procedures, allowing pilots to safely navigate in conditions that would otherwise have been catastrophic. Ms. Collins, called Colonel Hargrove, now resplendent in full-dress uniform adorned with ceremonial additions. "The Secretary would like a few minutes with you before the formal proceedings begin." In a private room adjacent to the exhibition, Mackenzie found herself face-to-face with the Secretary of Defense, a formidable woman whose career had broken numerous gender barriers in military leadership. "Ms. Collins," the Secretary greeted her warmly, "I wanted to thank you personally for your persistence in uncovering this history. What began with your discovery has triggered a comprehensive re-evaluation of how we document and recognize contributions to military innovation, particularly from individuals who operated outside traditional power structures." She gestured toward the exhibition visible through the glass walls. "Your grandmother's story represents a pattern we're now finding throughout military history, contributions deliberately obscured due to gender, race, or other factors that didn't align with the institutional narratives of their time." "She never received recognition during her lifetime," Mackenzie observed, the reality still difficult to fully accept. "No," the Secretary acknowledged, "but she created a pathway for eventual truth. The verification protocol she established, the authorization code she embedded in those documents, demonstrates remarkable foresight. She understood that society wasn't ready to acknowledge her contributions, but she ensured the evidence would be preserved until a time when that recognition became possible. As they spoke, Mackenzie noticed a distinctive sound growing outside, the unmistakable roar of aircraft engines, but with a vintage quality unlike modern jets. Through the windows, she could see a formation of World War II-era training aircraft approaching the National Mall in perfect precision, executing the distinctive approach pattern Eleanor had designed. "The Heritage Squadron," the secretary explained, noting Mackenzie's attention. "They've been practicing your grandmother's exact flight patterns for weeks. For today's ceremony, they'll demonstrate how her innovations transformed aviation safety, visible for everyone to witness." The formal ceremony that followed exceeded anything Mackenzie could have imagined when she first discovered her grandmother's journal in their farmhouse attic. On a stage, beneath a suspended wartime aircraft, military leaders and government officials gathered to formally acknowledge contributions that had remained classified for over 75 years. "Today, we correct a historical injustice," began General Winters, now serving as the ceremony's senior military representative. Eleanor Collins revolutionized aviation safety during World War II, creating systems and procedures that have saved countless lives across generations of pilots. Due to the classified nature of her work and the gender restrictions of her era, her contributions remained officially unacknowledged until now. With formal precision, he unveiled a document that would permanently alter historical records. By order of the Secretary of Defense, with congressional approval, Eleanor Collins is posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for exceptional contributions to military aviation safety systems that continue to protect service members. To this day, Mackenzie accepted the medal on her grandmother's behalf, the weight of the moment almost overwhelming as she recognized how completely one discovery had transformed not just her family's understanding, but national historical records. Most moving was the procession of pilots, retired and active duty, military and civilian, who came forward to share stories of how Eleanor's innovations had directly impacted their careers and safety. Men and women spanning generations described emergency landings guided by systems she had designed, their lives preserved by the work of a woman whose name they had never known until the recent declassification. In 1997, I was piloting a C-130 through severe weather when all primary navigation systems failed, recounted one Air Force colonel, her voice steady despite the evident emotion behind her words. The ECNL-42 approach protocol guided our aircraft to safety with zero visibility. Today, I finally get to thank the woman responsible for my crew's survival and to acknowledge that this standard procedure was actually the brilliant innovation of a female pilot who was denied the right to fly in combat herself. As the formal presentations concluded, Mackenzie found herself drawn to a particular exhibition section dedicated to the Invisible Wings Network, the informal alliance of female aviation experts who had worked together outside official channels. During an era when their expertise was systematically excluded from formal recognition. The recently declassified photographs showed Eleanor alongside other women whose contributions had similarly been obscured. Pilots, engineers, mathematicians, and designers who had advanced aviation while remaining deliberately anonymous in official records. "They made a strategic choice," observed General Mitchell, joining Mackenzie at the display. Now in her 80s, the pioneering female military pilot had become a bridge between generations of women in aviation. Faced with institutions that wouldn't acknowledge their expertise, they chose impact over recognition. knowing their innovations would save lives even if history never recorded their names. As the exhibition opened to the public following the ceremony, Mackenzie watched visitors engaging with her grandmother's story, examining the technical drawings, studying the runway lighting design, and absorbing the history that had remained. Hidden for decades, children crowded around the interactive displays, demonstrating Eleanor's mathematical calculations, while aviation professionals studied her original designs with professional appreciation. Most significant was the adjacent construction area, where museum staff were preparing a permanent installation, Hidden Figures in Aviation History, inspired by Eleanor's story, and dedicated to documenting other overlooked contributors whose innovations had shaped flight safety and technology, while their names remained absent from historical records. Late that afternoon, as the crowds continued to flow through the exhibition, Mackenzie found herself approached by a group of young women in Air Force Academy, uniforms, clearly cadets on an official visit. "Ms. Collins," their leader said with evident emotion, "we're the inaugural recipients of the Eleanor Collins Aviation Innovation Scholarships. We wanted to thank you personally for uncovering this history. Your grandmother is changing our futures even now." The scholarships, established through the Collins Historical Trust, provided specialized support for women pursuing careers in aviation engineering and safety systems, a living continuation of Eleanor's legacy beyond historical recognition. As evening approached and the museum prepared for a special night viewing of the exhibition, Mackenzie stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. Above Washington's iconic skyline, the Heritage Squadron performed one final demonstration flight, their vintage aircraft tracing Eleanor's precise patterns against the sunset sky, patterns that continued to guide military and civilian pilots. Worldwide, what had begun with a desperate search through her father's papers to save a financially troubled farm had uncovered not just a family secret, but a deliberate historical erasure that was now being systematically corrected. The jets that had fascinated her father throughout his life had been following paths designed by his mother, innovations that had saved countless lives while their creator remained anonymous, her contributions hidden beneath the surface of official history. As Mackenzie returned to the exhibition where Ryan was guiding family members through the displays, she realized that the farm had never truly been at risk. Eleanor Collins had ensured its protection decades earlier, anticipating a future where truth could finally emerge. A future that had arrived just in time, triggered by one granddaughter's determination to understand why a seemingly ordinary farm had been worth protecting at all costs. The family property that had so nearly been sold to developers was now officially designated as a National Historic Landmark, its eastern field preserved as a living testament to innovations that had shaped aviation history. What appeared to be simple farmland had been revealed as the testing ground for safety systems that continued to protect pilots worldwide, all designed by a woman whose contributions had been deliberately erased from official records until her granddaughter discovered a hidden journal and activated a verification protocol established decades before her birth. Spring sunlight filtered through newly installed windows as Mackenzie guided a group of aviation engineering students through what had once been her grandmother's barn. 1 year had passed since the discovery of Eleanor's journal, and the transformation of the Collins farm had exceeded anything Mackenzie could have imagined during those desperate days when foreclosure had seemed inevitable. "This was Eleanor's original design studio," she explained, gesturing around the meticulously restored space that now functioned as the main educational facility of the Eleanor Collins Center for Aviation Innovation. The barn's unremarkable exterior provided perfect cover for classified work during wartime, while these reinforced support beams were specifically designed to accommodate the testing equipment she developed. The students, Young women from universities across the country participating in the center's specialized internship program moved through the space with evident reverence, studying the historical displays alongside modern equipment that allowed them to test their own aviation safety innovations. "It's hard to imagine creating all this in secret," observed one student, examining Eleanor's original drafting table, "especially knowing your work would be attributed to others." "That's what makes her story so extraordinary," Mackenzie replied. "She prioritized the implementation of life-saving innovations over personal recognition, a different kind of contribution that required its own form of courage." Through the windows, Mackenzie could see the eastern field, now transformed into a living historical exhibition. Archaeological teams had carefully documented the buried runway infrastructure before restoring key sections for educational purposes. What had once appeared to be unsuitable farming land had been revealed as one of the most significant sites in aviation safety history, a testing ground for innovations that continued to protect pilots worldwide. The sound of approaching aircraft drew everyone's attention skyward. Not military jets this time, but a sleek research plane bearing the Eleanor Collins Center's distinctive logo. The center's partnership with major aviation companies and military research divisions had evolved rapidly, with the historic farm now functioning as both memorial and cutting-edge testing facility for next-generation safety systems. "Dr. Ramirez is back from the Washington conference," noted Ryan, who had joined the tour after concluding a meeting with the center's educational outreach team. His legal expertise had proven invaluable in establishing the complex structure that maintained the property's historical significance while enabling its evolution into a research and educational institution. The transformation of the Collins farm had been comprehensive but carefully balanced. The farmhouse itself had been restored to its 1940s appearance, serving as both historical exhibition and administrative headquarters. The Eastern Field's runway infrastructure had been partially excavated and preserved as a living educational exhibit. New research facilities had been constructed with meticulous attention to historical compatibility, creating a campus that honored the past while advancing future innovation. Most significant was the human transformation. The farm that had once faced foreclosure now employed over 40 staff members, historians, engineers, educators, and researchers working to preserve Eleanor's legacy while advancing the fields she had pioneered. The Collins Historical Trust, established with the declassified compensation funds, provided financial stability while supporting educational programs that focused specifically on promoting diversity in aviation engineering. As Commander Jessica, Ramirez's research plane taxied to a stop on the modern landing pad at the property's edge, Mackenzie excused herself from the tour group to greet the center's Director of Innovation Programs. The former military aviation engineer had been among the first to recognize the technical significance of Eleanor's designs and had subsequently left active duty to lead the center's research initiatives. "The Pentagon Review Committee has approved the next phase," Commander Ramirez announced as she approached, her excitement evident despite her professional demeanor. "We've received clearance to incorporate Eleanor's original night landing calculations into the new civilian emergency approach systems, full implementation across commercial aviation. This represented a significant expansion of Eleanor's legacy, extending her safety innovations beyond military applications into civilian air travel worldwide. What had begun as classified wartime developments would now protect millions of commercial airline passengers through enhanced emergency landing capabilities. She would have considered that the ultimate validation, Mackenzie observed, thinking of her grandmother's journal entries that consistently emphasized saving lives over receiving credit. Implementation was always her priority. As they walked, Back toward the main buildings, Commander Ramirez shared updates from the ongoing Pentagon review of the Invisible Wings network. They've identified 43 women whose technical contributions were systematically removed from official records between 1941 and 1975. Your grandmother's verification protocol has become the template for historical restoration, creating pathways to acknowledge contributions that were deliberately obscured. The afternoon brought another significant development as Colonel Hargrove, now heading the military's Historical Correction Division, arrived with preliminary designs for a national memorial to be established in Washington, D.C. Hidden heroes of aviation, the women who engineered safety. The congressional allocation was approved unanimously, the colonel explained, as she spread the architectural renderings across the conference table in what had once been Eleanor's kitchen. Your grandmother's story will serve as the centerpiece, but the memorial will acknowledge all the women whose contributions were systematically erased from official records. As the day progressed into evening, the center welcomed special visitors, elderly men and women who had served at Westfield Air Force Base during the 1950s and 60s, some of whom had interacted with Thomas Collins without ever knowing his connection to classified aviation history. Their stories added new dimensions to the family narrative, revealing how Eleanor's husband had quietly protected her legacy after her death while maintaining the secrecy her work required. Your grandfather would visit the base occasionally, recalled retired Master Sergeant James Wilson, now in his 80s. He always asked detailed questions about the approach lighting systems and emergency procedures, questions that seemed oddly specific for a farmer. Now we understand why. This revelation particularly affected Ryan, who had struggled to reconcile his limited memories of his grandfather with the complex family history that had emerged. So Grandpa Thomas was protecting her legacy too, in his own way. He maintained the secrecy while ensuring the innovations remained in use. Different generations, different approaches to the same commitment, Colonel Hargrove observed. Your grandfather maintained operational security in an era when classification was considered absolute. Your father preserved the property without fully understanding its significance. And you, she nodded toward Mackenzie, activated the verification protocol that finally brought everything into the light. As evening approached and the day's visitors departed, Mackenzie found herself drawn to the small family cemetery where both her father and grandparents were buried. Eleanor's headstone had been respectfully updated, now bearing the simple addition, Pioneering Aviator and Engineer, 1919-1965. Her innovations continue to guide pilots home safely. Beside it, her father's grave bore its own meaningful addition, Guardian of Legacy, 1945-2023. He protected what he could not fully know. The juxtaposition captured the generational aspects of their family story, different forms of service connected by commitment to something larger than individual recognition. Each had played a crucial role in preserving innovations that continued to save lives decades after their creation. As Mackenzie walked back toward the illuminated campus, now glowing with activity against the darkening sky, she reflected on how completely her understanding of legacy had transformed. What had initially seemed like a simple question of land ownership had revealed itself as something far more profound, a continuity of purpose that had spanned generations, with each family member playing their role without necessarily comprehending the full significance of their contributions. The Collins farm had never been merely property to be maintained or sold. It had been the physical embodiment of innovations that had shaped aviation safety worldwide. The jets that had fascinated her father throughout his life had been following patterns designed by his mother, patterns that continued to guide pilots home safely through dangerous conditions. As night fell completely, the center's specialized lighting system activated automatically, modern technology based directly on Eleanor's original designs, illuminating the pathways between buildings with the same principles that had guided aircraft to safe landings. For over 75 years, Dr. Catherine Reynolds, who had transitioned from Smithsonian curator to the center's historical director, joined Mackenzie on her walk back to the main building. "The first comprehensive biography will be released next month," she noted, referring to the official account of Eleanor Collins' life and contributions that had been carefully compiled from declassified records, family documents, and technical evaluations of her innovations. "What strikes me most about your grandmother's story isn't just the technical brilliance," Dr. Reynolds continued thoughtfully. "It's the strategic foresight. She didn't just create innovations, she created mechanisms to ensure those innovations would survive and continue saving lives regardless of whether she received credit. That represents a different kind of contribution, one that requires setting aside personal recognition for greater impact." As they reached the main educational facility, now hosting an evening seminar for aviation safety specialists, Mackenzie paused to observe the collaborative work continuing into the night. Engineers and historians worked side by side, studying Eleanor's original calculations to inform next-generation safety systems, creating direct continuity between innovations developed in secret during World War II and cutting-edge technologies that would protect future generations. What had begun with a desperate search through her father's papers to save a financially troubled farm had evolved into something far more significant. Not just historical correction, but ongoing innovation built upon foundations established decades earlier by a woman whose contributions had been deliberately erased from official records. The jets that passed overhead now carried a different meaning. Not just routine training flights, but living embodiments of safety systems designed by Eleanor Collins, whose name had been systematically removed from official credit, but whose innovations continued to guide pilots safely through dangerous conditions. The verification protocol she had established decades before Mackenzie's birth had finally activated, triggering not just historical recognition, but renewed appreciation for innovations that had never stopped protecting those who flew. The farm that had so nearly been sold to developers had been revealed as one of the most significant sites in aviation safety history, a testing ground for innovations that had saved countless lives while their creator remained anonymous. What appeared to be simple farmland contained beneath its surface not just the physical infrastructure of Eleanor's testing facilities, but the foundation of safety systems that continued to evolve and protect pilots worldwide. 5 years had passed since military helicopters first landed on the Collins farm, transforming not just a family's understanding of their heritage, but reshaping national recognition of women's contributions to aviation history. The autumn morning carried a familiar crispness as Mackenzie stood at the edge of the eastern field, watching a specialized aircraft execute a perfect landing on what had once been dismissed as unsuitable farming land. The modified approach vectors are performing exactly as predicted, reported Commander Ramirez. Now Dr. Ramirez, following her transition from military service to full-time leadership of the Eleanor Collins Center's research division. The integration of your grandmother's original calculations with modern GPS technology has reduced emergency approach incidents by 68% in commercial aviation. The FAA is fast-tracking implementation across all domestic airports. Mackenzie nodded, feeling the familiar sense of wonder at how her grandmother's innovations continued to evolve and save lives decades after their creation. The Eleanor Collins Center for Aviation Innovation had expanded beyond its original boundaries, now encompassing adjacent properties acquired as the institution's significance grew. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a family farm had evolved into a nationally recognized research and educational facility that bridged historical preservation with cutting-edge safety development. "The tour buses are arriving," noted Ryan, approaching from the main visitors center that had been constructed near the property entrance. Now serving as the center's executive director, he had traded corporate law for non-profit leadership, his legal expertise directed toward advancing the institution his grandmother had inadvertently founded through her classified innovations. "How many today?" Mackenzie asked, watching the vehicles approaching in the distance. "3 school groups, 2 aviation industry delegations, and a congressional committee evaluating the expansion funding," Ryan replied. "Plus the usual public visitors. We're expecting over 400 people before closing." The transformation of their family property had been comprehensive but carefully balanced. The original farmhouse and barn had been meticulously preserved as historical exhibits, while new facilities had been constructed with architectural elements that honored the property's heritage. The eastern field's runway infrastructure had been partially excavated and preserved as a living museum, with selected sections maintained in operational condition for educational demonstrations and testing. Most significant was the human transformation. The center now employed over 100 staff members, historians, engineers, educators, and researchers working to preserve Eleanor's legacy while advancing the fields she had pioneered. The educational programs operated at capacity, with specialized internships and fellowships supporting women pursuing careers in aviation safety and engineering. "The Invisible Wings exhibition opens in Tokyo next month," Ryan continued as they walked toward the main campus. "That makes 17 countries hosting the traveling exhibition this year alone. Eleanor's story has literally gone global." The international impact had been among the most unexpected developments. What began as the discovery of one woman's hidden contributions had triggered worldwide re-examination of how women's innovations had been systematically excluded from official historical records across multiple fields. Hidden Figures in Aviation exhibitions had expanded to include programs focused on women's unacknowledged contributions to mathematics, computer science, medicine, and other technical fields. As they approached the central plaza that connected the center's various facilities, Mackenzie noticed an elderly woman in a wheelchair being assisted by what appeared to be multiple generations of her family. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, though Mackenzie couldn't immediately place the connection. "Is that?" Ryan began, apparently recognizing the visitor. "Margaret Barrett," confirmed Colonel Hargrove, now General Hargrove, following her promotion to lead the military's expanded historical correction division. "Major Thomas Barrett's daughter. She contacted us last month after the Pentagon declassified the final Nighthawk files." The name instantly connected for Mackenzie. Major Barrett had been mentioned repeatedly in Eleanor's journal as her primary military contact during the establishment of the auxiliary landing field. The elderly woman, now being guided toward them, represented another living connection to her grandmother's classified past. "Ms. Collins," the elderly woman greeted Mackenzie with evident emotion. "I've waited nearly 70 years for this moment. Your grandmother and my father worked together to create the systems that have saved countless lives, but their full collaboration could never be acknowledged during their lifetimes." As they settled in the center's private conference room, Margaret Barrett shared photographs and documents that added new dimensions to Eleanor's story. Her father, it emerged, had recognized Eleanor's genius during a chance encounter at a civilian airfield in 1941, when she had corrected his approach calculations during deteriorating weather conditions. "My father was enlightened enough to recognize expertise regardless of gender," Margaret explained, her voice carrying the weight of long-held family history finally being shared. "When the war demanded rapid innovation in aviation safety, he created unofficial channels for your grandmother to contribute despite institutional barriers that would have otherwise excluded her completely. The materials she shared revealed a more comprehensive picture of the Invisible Wings Network, the informal alliance of female aviation experts who had contributed to military advancement while remaining deliberately anonymous in official records. Major Barrett had created administrative pathways that allowed their innovations to be implemented without triggering the institutional resistance that would have emerged had their gender been acknowledged. My father kept meticulous personal records, Margaret continued, opening a leather portfolio containing documents that had remained in her family's private possession for decades. He believed someday the full truth could be acknowledged, but he understood that operational implementation of life-saving measures took priority over proper attribution during wartime. As the day progressed, Margaret's family members, including grandchildren and great-grandchildren pursuing careers in aviation, toured the center with evident emotional connection to its mission. The unexpected visit had created another bridge between past and present, connecting families whose predecessors had collaborated in secret to advance aviation safety while navigating the gender restrictions of their era. Late that afternoon, as scheduled activities continued throughout the campus, Mackenzie found herself drawn to her grandmother's original design studio in the restored barn. The space had been maintained exactly as Eleanor had left it, with her drafting table, calculation tools, and technical references preserved as a historical exhibit. General Hargrove joined her there, having developed a close connection with the Collins family throughout the 5 years of historical restoration and institutional development. Margaret Barrett's visit adds another valuable dimension to the historical record, she observed. Each new connection reveals how deliberately these networks operated outside official channels, when those channels excluded certain contributors based on gender. What still amazes me is the foresight, Mackenzie replied, examining her grandmother's original verification protocol documents displayed in a climate-controlled case. She created this elaborate system to ensure eventual recognition, but only after her innovations had been fully implemented and their value conclusively demonstrated. That represents a profound strategic intelligence, the general noted. She understood that premature demands for recognition might have prevented implementation altogether. By accepting temporary invisibility, she ensured her life-saving measures would be adopted and normalized within aviation practice. As evening approached and the day's visitors departed, Mackenzie found herself walking the perimeter of the eastern field, where architectural lighting now illuminated the preserved sections of runway infrastructure. The jets from Westfield Air Force Base continued their regular training flights overhead, still following approach patterns that Eleanor had established decades earlier, a living connection between past innovation and present safety. Ryan joined her, carrying designs for the center's planned expansion, new educational facilities specifically focused on engaging young women in aviation engineering and safety design. The Congressional Committee seems receptive to the funding proposal, he noted, his business acumen now directed toward securing his grandmother's legacy rather than liquidating family assets. Sometimes I still can't believe how close we came to selling this place to developers, Mackenzie said, watching the specialized lighting system activate automatically as darkness deepened. All of this would have been buried beneath houses and shopping centers. Eleanor wouldn't have allowed that, Ryan replied with confidence that had developed throughout their years of learning about their grandmother's methodical planning. The verification protocol was designed to activate precisely when the property faced immediate threat. She planned for every contingency, including descendants who might not understand the land's significance. As they walked back toward the main campus, now illuminated against the darkening sky, They discussed the upcoming international conference the center would host, bringing together aviation safety experts, historians, and engineers to explore the continuing relevance of Eleanor's innovations for next-generation aircraft systems. The Pentagon's comprehensive review has now identified over 60 women whose contributions were systematically erased from official aviation records between 1940 and 1975, Ryan noted, referring to the ongoing historical correction project that had expanded far beyond their grandmother's specific case. Eleanor's story opened the floodgates for historical re-evaluation across multiple fields. What had begun with one desperate search through family papers had triggered cascading reassessments of how women's contributions had been systematically excluded from official historical records, not just in aviation, but across scientific and technical fields where institutional barriers had forced innovative women to operate through unofficial channels or accept having their work attributed to male colleagues. As night fell completely over the Eleanor Collins Center for Aviation Innovation, the pathways between buildings glowed with lighting systems based directly on Eleanor's original designs, modern technology implementing principles she had established 75 years earlier to guide pilots safely through darkness and dangerous conditions. The farm that had so nearly been sold for development had been revealed as one of the most significant sites in aviation safety history, a testing ground for innovations that had saved countless lives while their creator remained anonymous. What appeared to be simple farmland contained beneath its surface not just the physical infrastructure of Eleanor's testing facilities, but the foundation of safety systems that continued to evolve and protect those who flew. The jets that passed overhead now carried a different meaning. Not just routine training flights, but living embodiments of safety systems designed by Eleanor Collins, whose name had been systematically removed from official credit, but whose innovations had never stopped guiding pilots safely home. The verification protocol she had established decades before Mackenzie's birth had finally activated, triggering not just historical recognition, but renewed appreciation for innovations that continued to evolve and protect future generations. What Eleanor Collins couldn't achieve in her lifetime, proper recognition for her contributions to aviation safety, she had ensured would eventually emerge through careful preservation of evidence and strategic planning that anticipated future circumstances. The diary Mackenzie had discovered in a desperate search to save her family farm had unlocked not just historical correction, but ongoing innovation built upon foundations established by a woman who had chosen impact over acknowledgement, trusting that someday truth would prevail. 10 years had passed since Mackenzie Collins first discovered her grandmother's leather-bound journal in the farmhouse attic. The summer morning buzzed with activity as final preparations were made for what many were calling the most significant aviation safety conference of the decade. Delegates from 68 countries had gathered at the now internationally renowned Eleanor Collins Center for Aviation Innovation to witness the official implementation of the Collins Protocol across global commercial aviation. The simulator results exceeded even our most optimistic projections, Dr. Jessica Ramirez reported, presenting data displays to the assembled team in what had once been the farm's simple barn, but now served as the center's advanced research facility. The integration of Eleanor's original approach vector calculations with contemporary AI-assisted navigation systems has reduced emergency landing incidents by nearly 80% in high-stress scenarios. Mackenzie nodded, still feeling the familiar sense of wonder at how innovations developed in secret during World War II continued to evolve and save lives decades later. The Eleanor Collins Center had expanded far beyond its original boundaries, now encompassing over 500 acres with multiple research facilities, educational buildings, and the meticulously preserved historical sites that formed the heart of their mission. The Secretary of Transportation will arrive at noon, Ryan noted, checking his tablet as notifications continued to stream in. Now serving as the center's international relations director, he had leveraged his legal and business background to forge partnerships with aviation authorities worldwide. Representatives from ASA, CAAC, and 16 other international aviation administrations have confirmed their participation in the formal adoption ceremony. The Collins Protocol represented the culmination of a decade's work. Systematically, integrating Eleanor's original safety innovations with modern technology to create a unified emergency approach system that would be implemented globally. What had begun with equations sketched in a farmer's wife's secret journal had evolved into international standards that would protect millions of air travelers worldwide. As final preparations continued throughout the campus, Mackenzie found herself drawn to the original farmhouse, now maintained as both historical exhibit and special reception area for distinguished visitors. The kitchen table, where she had once stared hopelessly at a foreclosure notice, now displayed her grandmother's original journal in a specialized preservation case. The document that had triggered not just her family's transformation, but a fundamental reassessment of women's unacknowledged contributions to aviation history. It's still remarkable to think how close we came to losing all of this, observed General Victoria Hargrove, now retired from active duty but serving as the center's historical integrity officer. The decade-long friendship that had developed between them reflected their shared commitment to preserving Eleanor's legacy while advancing her innovations. Not just the property, Mackenzie replied, but the entire history. If we'd sold to the developers, everything would have been bulldozed, including the buried runway infrastructure. We'd never have known what lay beneath the surface. The phrase had become something of a metaphor for their work. What lies beneath the surface, encompassing both the physical infrastructure hidden beneath the farmland and the historical contributions, deliberately obscured in official records. The Eleanor Collins Center had pioneered methodologies for identifying and verifying women's unacknowledged technical innovations across multiple fields, with specialized research divisions now extending beyond aviation to explore similar patterns in aerospace engineering, computer science, and medical technology. The Invisible Wings International Registry has now documented over 300 women whose aviation innovations were systematically excluded from official credit between 1930 and 1980, General Hargrove noted, referencing the comprehensive database that had emerged from their work. Eleanor's verification protocol provided the template for historical restoration methodologies now being implemented across disciplines. Through the farmhouse windows, Mackenzie could see specialized aircraft arriving at the center's dedicated airfield. No longer just military helicopters, but international delegations bringing aviation officials who would participate in the formal adoption of the Collins Protocol. The eastern field that had once been dismissed as unsuitable for farming had been revealed as one of aviation history's most significant sites, where innovations that would eventually protect millions had been developed in deliberate secrecy. Thus, historical symmetry is powerful, observed Dr. Catherine Reynolds, joining them after finalizing arrangements for the day's exhibition. Now serving as director of the Smithsonian's expanded Women in Aviation division while maintaining her connection to the center, she had devoted the past decade to documenting the systematic exclusion of women's contributions from technical fields. Eleanor developed these systems at a time when women were explicitly barred from equal participation in aviation. Today, those same innovations will be formally adopted by an industry where women now serve as pilots, engineers, and safety officials. As they moved toward the main conference center, built to harmonize with the property's agricultural heritage while accommodating international events, Mackenzie noticed a group of young women in distinctive uniforms touring the historical exhibits. "The first graduating class of Collins Fellows," Ryan explained, noting her interest. 28 women completing their advanced aviation safety engineering program. The fellowship program represented one of the center's most significant achievements, providing specialized training and mentorship for women pursuing careers in aviation safety innovation. What had begun as a small scholarship initiative had evolved into an internationally recognized program that placed graduates in influential positions throughout the industry, creating a new generation of innovators building directly upon Eleanor's foundation. The formal proceedings began precisely at noon, with representatives from global aviation authorities gathered in the center's grand auditorium. The Secretary of Transportation, a woman whose own career had broken numerous barriers in transportation policy leadership, opened the ceremony with remarks that connected past innovation to future implementation. "Today marks the formal adoption of the Collins Protocol across global commercial aviation," she announced to the assembled delegates. "Standards developed from innovations that began in secret on this very property during World War II will now protect air travelers worldwide. This represents not just technical advancement, but historical correction, officially acknowledging contributions that were systematically excluded from recognition for decades." Most meaningful to Mackenzie was the presentation that followed. Technical demonstrations showing how Eleanor's approach vector calculations from the 1940s had been systematically integrated with contemporary technology to create enhanced safety systems for modern aircraft. The engineers presenting these systems included several Collins Fellows who had developed specific components building directly upon Eleanor's foundation, creating unbroken continuity between innovations begun in wartime secrecy and cutting-edge implementations that would save lives for generations to come. "Your grandmother would find this particularly appropriate," General Hargrove commented quietly as they watched the presentations. Her focus was always on implementation rather than recognition. Today achieves both. Formal acknowledgement of her contributions while maximizing their practical impact. The afternoon included the unveiling of another significant development, the expansion of the invisible wings historical restoration methodology beyond aviation to other technical fields where women's contributions had been systematically obscured. Representatives from medical research institutions, computer science organizations, and aerospace engineering consortiums described how the verification protocols pioneered through Eleanor's case had been adapted to identify and restore recognition to women whose innovations had been similarly concealed in official records. The Eleanor Collins Center has established the gold standard for historical restoration methodologies, noted the director of the National Archives' newly established Division for Historical Correction. The rigorous verification processes developed here have transformed how we approach suspected cases of contribution erasure across scientific and technical disciplines. As evening approached and the formal proceedings transitioned to a reception for the international delegates, Mackenzie found herself standing beside the center's newest installation, a wall bearing the names of every woman whose aviation contributions had been verified through the Invisible Wings Registry. Eleanor's name held the central position, but surrounding it were hundreds of others whose innovations had similarly been obscured in official records, but subsequently verified through the methodologies pioneered at the center. Ryan joined her. There, his expression reflecting the profound journey they had shared since those desperate days when selling the farm had seemed their only option. "Did you ever imagine when you found that journal that it would lead to all this?" "Not remotely," Mackenzie admitted, watching the international aviation officials mingling with Collins fellows, historical researchers, and engineering specialists throughout the reception. I was just trying to find some way to save the farm. I never imagined we'd end up transforming aviation history. As darkness fell over the Eleanor Collins Center for Aviation Innovation, specialized lighting activated automatically along the pathways, systems based directly on Eleanor's original runway illumination designs, adapted for pedestrian guidance, while maintaining the essential principles she had established. Above, the familiar sound of jets from Westfield Air Force Base traced their routine training patterns overhead, still following approach vectors Eleanor had calculated decades earlier, now enhanced with the additional safety measures being implemented worldwide. The farm that had so nearly been lost to foreclosure and development had been revealed as one of the most significant sites in aviation safety history. What appeared to be simple agricultural land contained beneath its surface not just the physical infrastructure of Eleanor's testing facilities, but the foundation of safety systems that would now protect air travelers globally for generations to come. What had begun with one desperate search through family papers had triggered cascading reassessments of how women's contributions had been systematically excluded from official historical records, not just in aviation, but across scientific and technical fields where institutional barriers had forced innovative women to operate through unofficial channels or accept having their work attributed to others. As the international delegates continued their discussions into the evening, planning implementation details for the Collins Protocol across diverse aviation systems worldwide, Mackenzie reflected on the extraordinary journey from that moment of discovering her grandmother's journal to this global adoption of her innovations. The diary found during a desperate attempt to save a family farm had unlocked not just historical correction, but ongoing advancement built upon foundations established by a woman who had chosen impact over acknowledgement, creating pathways for both her innovations and her story to eventually emerge when the world was ready to receive them. 25 years had passed since military helicopters first landed on the Collins farm, triggered by Mackenzie's discovery of her grandmother's secret journal. The autumn morning carried a familiar crispness as she stood at the edge of the eastern field, watching a formation of aircraft approach from the horizon. Not military jets this time, but a precisely coordinated demonstration by the international Eleanor Collins Heritage Squadron, flying restored vintage aircraft alongside modern planes specially equipped with the Collins Protocol safety systems. "They're right on schedule," noted her niece, Captain Ellie Collins, now a senior test pilot, for the Center's Aviation Safety Division. Named after the grandmother she had never met, but whose legacy had shaped her life's direction, Ellie represented the third generation of Collins women connected to aviation innovation. Though unlike her great-grandmother, she flew with full recognition of her expertise and contributions. "The 1,000th Collins Fellow graduates today," Mackenzie replied, watching the aircraft execute a perfect formation approach using the very patterns Eleanor had designed decades earlier. "Your great-grandmother couldn't have imagined this when she was sketching calculations in secret during World War II. The Eleanor Collins Center for Aviation Innovation had evolved beyond anything Mackenzie could have envisioned during those desperate days when foreclosure had loomed over the family farm. What had begun as a modest historical site had developed into an internationally renowned institution spanning over 2,000 acres, with specialized research facilities, educational campuses, and preserved historical areas that welcomed over 500,000 visitors annually. Most significant was the human legacy, a global network of Collins Fellows now holding influential positions throughout aviation and aerospace industries worldwide. The specialized training program had expanded from its initial focus on women in aviation safety to become the gold standard for innovation leadership across technical fields, while maintaining its core mission of ensuring diversity in industries, where contributions had historically been unequally recognized. The Secretary-General just landed, Ryan reported, approaching them with the distinguished efficiency he had maintained throughout his 25 years guiding the center's institutional development. Now in his late 60s, but showing no signs of slowing down, he had transformed from the corporate attorney who had once pushed to sell the farm into one of the most respected advocates for historical restoration and educational innovation. The United Nations delegation is already touring the original farmhouse, he continued. The International Advisory Committee will join them after the graduation ceremony. The occasion marking the center's 25th anniversary had drawn global leadership not just from aviation, but from the worldwide movement that had emerged to identify and correct historical erasures across scientific and technical fields. What had begun with the discovery of one woman's hidden contributions had catalyzed systematic reassessment of how institutional barriers had obscured innovations developed by those excluded from official recognition based on gender, race, and other factors. As they walked toward the main campus, now a harmonious blend of preserved historical structures and state-of-the-art facilities, they passed tour groups exploring the meticulously maintained historical exhibits, Eleanor's original design studio in the restored barn, the excavated sections of runway infrastructure, and the farmhouse where Mackenzie had discovered the journal that triggered everything that followed. It's still hard to believe how close we came to losing all of this, Mackenzie commented, looking across the property that had transformed from a financially struggling farm to an internationally significant institution. If we'd sold to Meridian Development, everything would have been bulldozed. The buried runway, Eleanor's studio, all of it. Eleanor wouldn't have let that happen, Ryan replied with the certainty that had developed throughout their decades, learning about their grandmother's methodical foresight. The verification protocol was designed to activate precisely when needed. She understood that future generations might not recognize the significance of what lay beneath the surface until it was almost too late. The graduation ceremony for the 1,000th class of Collins Fellows took place in the center's grand auditorium, with representatives from global aviation authorities, educational institutions, and historical organizations gathered to mark both the program milestone and the center's 25th anniversary. Each fellow receiving certification represented a direct continuation of Eleanor's legacy. Aviation safety specialists trained in both technical innovation and the historical context of women's contributions to the field. Most powerful was the keynote address delivered by Dr. Sarah Nguyen, the first Collins Fellow who had risen to become Director of Global Aviation Safety for the International Civil Aviation Organization. Her remarks connected past innovation to future implementation, while acknowledging the broader significance of Eleanor's story beyond technical achievements. The Collins Protocol has now been implemented in every ICAO member state, she noted, referencing the safety standards derived from Eleanor's original innovations that now protected air travelers worldwide. But the methodologies developed here to identify and verify unacknowledged contributions have even broader significance. The invisible wings framework has been adapted to restore historical credit across disciplines where institutional barriers, once obscured innovations developed by those excluded from official recognition. Following the ceremony, Mackenzie joined a special tour group of particularly meaningful visitors, elderly women in their 80s and 90s, many using mobility assistance, but maintaining the sharp intelligence that had characterized their careers. These were the last surviving members of the generation that had followed immediately after Eleanor's, women who had entered aviation and engineering fields in the 1950s and 60s when barriers remained formidable but were beginning to crack. Your grandmother's verification protocol inspired me to create my own, explained Dr. Margaret Chen, now in her early 90s, but still serving as an advisor to the center's historical verification methodology team. When my engine cooling system designs were attributed to my male laboratory director in 1962, I created documentation mechanisms ensuring eventual correction. The historical record was finally amended last year, using verification methodologies pioneered through Eleanor's case. As the tour progressed through the center's comprehensive museum space, Hidden Figures in Technical Innovation, Mackenzie was struck by how completely their understanding of historical contributions had been transformed. What had begun with the discovery of one woman's hidden journal had expanded into systematic reassessment of how innovations had been developed, implemented, and credited throughout modern technological history. The farm that had so nearly been sold to developers had been revealed as one of the most significant sites in aviation safety history. What appeared to be simple agricultural land contained beneath its surface not just the physical infrastructure of Eleanor's testing facilities, but the foundation of safety systems that now protected air travelers globally. The story of what lay hidden beneath this seemingly ordinary surface had catalyzed worldwide reassessment of how innovations emerge, evolve, and become incorporated into standard practice, often through contributions deliberately obscured in official records. As Mackenzie rejoined the international reception where Collins Fellows from 25 graduating classes mingled with aviation officials, historians, and researchers from around the world, she reflected on the extraordinary journey from that moment of discovering her grandmother's journal to this global institution advancing both technical innovation and historical correction. Eleanor Collins had understood something profound about progress that transcended her specific technical contributions, that sometimes advancing crucial innovations requires accepting temporary invisibility when institutional barriers would otherwise prevent implementation altogether. By creating verification protocols that would activate when future circumstances allowed, she had ensured that both her life-saving measures and her personal story would eventually receive proper recognition when society evolved enough to acknowledge contributions it had once systematically excluded from official credit. The jets that passed overhead now carried a different meaning. Not just routine training flights, but living embodiments of safety systems designed by a woman, whose name had been systematically removed from official credit, but whose innovations had never stopped guiding pilots safely home through challenging conditions. The verification protocol she had established decades before Mackenzie's birth had finally activated, triggering not just historical recognition, but renewed appreciation for contributions that continued to protect lives worldwide. What had begun with one family's struggle to save their farm had expanded into systematic reassessment of how innovation history is documented, credited, and understood, creating methodologies that continued identifying and verifying contributions deliberately obscured across technical fields. Eleanor Collins' legacy lived on not just in the safety systems that protected air travelers worldwide, but in the rigorous verification protocols that continued uncovering other invisible wings whose innovations had similarly shaped modern life while their creators remained unacknowledged in official records. The thousands of visitors exploring the Eleanor Collins Center that evening represented the culmination of her foresight, a world finally ready to acknowledge contributions it had once systematically excluded from recognition. The diary Mackenzie had discovered 25 years earlier had unlocked not just her grandmother's specific story, but a broader understanding of how progress often emerges through contributions deliberately hidden beneath the surface of official history, waiting for future generations to recognize their value and restore their rightful place in the record of human achievement. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.